In this video, we're going to talk a little bit more about the if statement before we begin looking at its alternative versions. Now, back in the preceding lesson, we demonstrated the basic functionality of the if statement. Let's do that again here by first declaring a variable called grade, and we'll give it the value 85. And let's write an if statement that's going to check whether the grade value is greater than or equal to 60, which when you're taking a course is normally an indication that you passed the course. And in the body or the suite of that if statement, let's go ahead and simply display the string passed if in fact the grade is greater than or equal to 60. Now, based on what we defined grade to be up above, this condition will be true, and as I execute this statement, it's going to show me the word passed. Now, before I continue, I just want to point out here that when you press enter on an indented suite line inside of a control statement like the if statement, it assumes that you'd like to continue defining the body or the suite of that statement. So in order to actually execute the code, I now have to press enter once again, and at this point I can see the string passed gets displayed. Now, we started to briefly mention in the preceding lesson this issue of indentation in Python. Unlike most C-based languages, which typically use curly braces like the left curly brace and the right curly brace that I just typed here to delimit the body of a control statement like the if statement, in Python the suite of an if statement and similarly other control statements is defined by indentation only. The default indentation level is 4 spaces, and that's what I got here automatically when I simply pressed enter while typing the code in the context of the interactive IPython interpreter. If you're working in an integrated development environment, then you'll typically have 4 spaces by default, although that is configurable. And there's nothing that says you have to use 4 spaces. What Python does require, however, is that whatever indentation level you choose, and whether you choose to use spaces or tabs, you have to do that uniformly for everything in a given suite. So if, for example, I recall the statement that I just did, and let me go back up to the print line and get rid of the indentation. So when you're defining an if statement, it expects its suite to be indented. This is actually an error in Python, and to demonstrate that, let me go ahead and press enter, and now you can see that I have an indentation error, and it's telling me the statement that was not indented properly. Now, similarly, going back into my if statement here, let me put the 4 spaces back in. If the indentation is not consistent, that also is a problem. So, for example, in this first suite statement, I have 4 spaces before the print. On the next line, I've removed 2 of those spaces, and let's create another print statement that says good job, exclamation point. And if I now go ahead and try to execute this statement, once again I get an indentation error, this time pointing to the good job line, and the reason is there are only 2 spaces in front of print in this case as opposed to 4 spaces up above. So not only do you have to maintain the consistency of your spacing, the interpreter is going to check that spacing for you. And it turns out there's also static code analysis tools that can scan larger code files for things like this as well. So that's the basics of the if statement. Now, another thing I want to point out about the if statement is the fact that the condition can be any expression that evaluates to true or false. And it turns out that in Python, everything has a value of true or false associated with it. So for example, if I go ahead and say if 1, any value that's non-zero is going to be treated as true, and 0 is treated as false. So if I say if1 and I want to do a print statement here that simply says non-zero values are true, so this will print. So we got a little if statement there. I expect to see the print happen in this case because 1 is considered to be true. So when I execute that, sure enough, it does execute. On the other hand, if I use 0, which is false by default in Python, and I do a little print statement and say 0 is false, so this will not print. You can see that indeed nothing is displayed as a result of that condition. Now, as we move forward through subsequent lessons, we're going to see that more complex objects also can be evaluated as true or false. So, for example, a string that contains characters would be considered true, and an empty string that contains no characters would be considered false. And similarly, when we get into the various Python data structures, which we'll start to do here in this lesson, they too can be evaluated that way. So a collection of items that has elements in it, has items in it, like a collection of random integers, that would be considered true, whereas an empty collection would generally be considered false. Now, there's one other thing that I want to point out about conditions, specifically with the double equals operator. If we go and write an expression like grade is assigned 85, which is what we did up above, that is going to assign the value 85 to the variable grade. Now, before I execute that, let me get rid of that. Let's assume grade already exists, which it does up above. We defined it. So if I go and write by accident grade double equals 85, you can see that I get a result of true, because if I scroll back up here, you can see that indeed grade was 85. So if I mistakenly, accidentally typed 2 equal signs, then I would get a Boolean value. Similarly, if I mistakenly was trying to assign a value, and let's say we made it 58, in this case, I get back false when what I really wanted to do was change the value of grade. So, of course, I need a single equal sign in order to be able to do that. And now grade has a new value associated with it. Another potential logic error would be, let's say I want to compare x to 85, and I have not defined x yet. In that case, as we demonstrated once before, you get a name error because the name x does not yet exist in this interactive session.